Dr. King's dream. It will be 50 years ago this August when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. and delivered, intoned, exalted, sang what is deemed by many the greatest American speech of the 20th century. This morning I want to honor the memory and the continuing moral guidance of Dr. King by looking at how much of his dream has come true and how much of it is still unfulfilled. In my second semester of Divinity School, I was privileged to take a class on preaching, taught by two eminent UU ministers, Jane Jepka and Ken Sawyer. For the first class, we watched this I Have a Dream speech, and we were going to analyze it for delivery and content. But after the video had finished running, we all sat in stunned silence for a few minutes until someone could speak. The speech still has that effect on me, no matter how many times I see it. Let's set the stage. The Civil Rights Movement had been gathering steam through the 1950s, but they found that winning victories over segregation in the courts was not helping enough on the ground. They needed Congress to pass some new legislation. A lot of its leaders pinned great hopes on the election of a Democratic president, but John Kennedy had disappointed them by not pushing for comprehensive civil rights legislation until the summer of 1963. Once Kennedy got behind the civil rights bill, the leadership of the civil rights movement called for a mass march on Washington to demonstrate support for the measure, which is how there came to be 200,000 people in front of the Lincoln Memorial on August the 28th. The crowd heard from Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Peter, Paul, and Mary. They heard from A. Philip Randolph, the head of the coalition which put on the march. They heard the unforgettable voice of Mahalia Jackson. And then Dr. King was introduced as the moral leader of this country. According to people who helped King with the speech, he did not really know what he was going to say up to 24 hours before the speech. The organizers were really nervous about the turnout, but the crowd was as large as they could have ever hoped for. King began by pointing to the historical context of the rally 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation and in the shadow of Lincoln's statue. He evoked the Gettysburg Address and then launched into an extended metaphor about how the promise of liberty and equality in the Declaration of Independence were a promissory note, a debt owed by America to its African-American citizens. He said that the payments which the country had made on this debt were returned dishonored, like bad checks, marked insufficient funds, but that he refused to believe that the Bank of Justice had gone bankrupt. As clever as the metaphor was, it would not have made the speech great. He preaches the necessity of nonviolence and tells his audience not to live in hatred or despair, give in to hatred or despair. He acknowledges the trials and difficulties many have gone through to get to this day. All of these were things that needed to be said. But the speech did not take wings until Dr. King went off script. Some say that Mahalia Jackson, standing in the crowd near the podium, shouted, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." Whether that is true, the video clearly shows that at some point he straightened up and launches into his stream of consciousness. He had given speeches on his dream before, but on this occasion he wove in anything that came into his mind, and in doing so he touched something essential in America. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream is essentially a report card on freedom and equality in America, a century after Lincoln's report card, the Gettysburg Address. I preached on the Gettysburg Address in February of 2009, the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth, and took from Gary Wills's great book on that address the notion that, as best we can tell, Lincoln's basic religious flavor was transcendentalist, and he was influenced by the Unitarian Transcendentalist minister Theodore Parker. In Parker's thought, there was, in religion and politics, a realm of permanent ideals and the realm of transient realities. Here's what Parker wrote in 1856. "By Christianity, I mean that form of religion which consists of piety, the love of God and morality, the keeping of his laws. That is not the Christianity of the Christian church. nor of any one sect. It is the ideal religion which the human race has been groping for. By democracy, I mean the government over all the people, by all the people, and for the sake of all. This is not the democracy of the parties, but is that ideal government, the reign of righteousness, the kingdom of justice, which all noble hearts long for and labor to produce. The ideal whereunto mankind slowly draws near. Here is the American program of political principles. All men are endowed by their Creator with certain natural rights. These rights can be alienated only by the possessor thereof. In respect thereto, all men are equal. But the means to that end, the Constitution itself, is by no means unitary. It is a provisional compromise between the ideal political principle of the Declaration and the actual selfishness of the people, North and South. Unquote. Those are the words of Theodore Parker, 1856. Lincoln's thought in the Gettysburg Address not only borrowed Parker's formulation of the people, by the people, for the people, but paralleled this contrast between the ideal and the real, saying that the country was conceived in liberty and dedicated to equality, but the terrible war was a test as to whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated could endure in the real world. Some of you may have seen the recent Steven Spielberg movie, Lincoln, which focuses on a pivotal few weeks between Lincoln's re-election and his inauguration, when, against all the advice of his cabinet and cronies, he put the 13th Amendment through Congress even as he was trying to wind down the war. What the movie makes you realize is that the ending of slavery in America was not a foregone conclusion after the Emancipation Proclamation or even after the war. If the Southern states had been readmitted to the Union through a negotiated peace, they probably would have insisted on maintaining the institution of slavery and would have persisted in the border states at any event which they were not covered by the Emancipation Proclamation. It took both the passage of the 13th Amendment and the military defeat of the Confederate forces for slavery to finally end. And then the movie wrestles with the question the abolitionists wrestled with too. What then? What to do with the ex-slaves? Lincoln himself was seriously considering a proposal to resettle the freed slaves in Panama. The country may have been dedicated to the proposition that all were created equal, but the idea of living side by side with people of color as equals did not sit well with most of the white population of the 19th century. Who knows what kind of leadership Lincoln may have shown on combating racism had he lived. Though slavery had been abolished, Lincoln was not around to lead us. And modern racism, which was an invention of the 19th century, whose purpose had been to provide a moral justification for slavery, lived on after the institution of slavery had vanished. And as soon as the Reconstruction troops were withdrawn from the South, the white power structure reasserted itself and started enacting the system of quasi-slavery known as Jim Crow, in spite of the fact that the Reconstruction Congress had also passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing the former slaves all the constitutional rights of other American citizens, and the 15th guaranteeing them the right to vote. The first target of the movement for black liberation in the 20th century was the courts, and after decades of groundwork, they succeeded in getting rulings striking down segregated schools. Emboldened by this, they then set their sights on other forms of segregation in public life. I can remember when theaters had separate entrances for blacks and whites, separate drinking fountains, separate restrooms. My family doctor's office had separate waiting rooms for whites and blacks. Can you imagine the indignity and inconvenience of not being able to eat in restaurants, sleep in motels, or use public bathrooms? Despite years of sit-ins and freedom rides, by 1963, there was still no federal statute desegregating public accommodations, and that was the object of the March on Washington. King alluded to the right to eat and sleep in public facilities, but his dream was really beyond that. The heart of King's dream for America is a distinct echo of Lincoln's ideal in the Gettysburg Address. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Unquote. This ideal, this creed of equality, was painfully inconsistent with the reality of racial segregation, which at the time he spoke was part of the culture of the South, de facto segregation, and also still enforced by law, or de jure segregation, just as in Lincoln's time it had been inconsistent with slavery. However, this is not the most memorable quote from the dream speech. The quote most of us remember is, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The first quote, the allusion to the Declaration of Independence, stays on the plane of the ideal and the abstract. In the second quote, King brings it down to the personal. Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address 87, or 87 years after the Declaration of Independence. King gave his speech 100 years after Lincoln, and today we are 50 years after King. How has this dream fared? Well, we can say at least that de jure racial segregation has gone, vanished from the legal landscape as completely as slavery did, which is to say, not so completely. It still has remnants. Segregation in public accommodations was outlawed by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, passed by Congress at the urging of President Johnson after Kennedy was assassinated. I can remember being a teenager in the South as my parents and aunts and uncles and the pundits predicted doomsday was approaching. Owners of barbecue joints, for some reason, took the lead in announcing resistance to the new law. Lester Maddox, a barbecue restaurant owner in Atlanta, offered to give out axe handles to his customers to help him defend his restaurant against an onslaught of blacks. That was puzzling to me, because as near as I could tell, the black folks I knew liked barbecue just as much as the whites, and were at least as adept at cooking and flavoring it. And then the dreaded day arrived, and guess what? Blacks and whites sat down and ate in restaurants together. And it was all so natural that no one really even asked what all the fuss had been about. But Lester Maddox went on to be governor of Georgia. The death of de jure segregation did not mean the end of racism in the justice system. We have always incarcerated black men at a rate far higher than their proportion of the population. Quote, "Today more black men are under the control of the criminal justice system than were slaves in the decade before the Civil War," according to Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, unquote. In the 1990s, we had 2 public trials which exposed the different assumptions of justice under which black Americans and white America operate. One was the acquittal of the policemen who beat Rodney King. The other was the acquittal of O.J. Simpson. I remember that the Simpson verdict was handed down shortly after I had arrived at divinity school, and I sought out the head of the Black Students Organization and proposed that we have a public forum to discuss the case. But he declined, saying the topic was too raw to have an interracial discussion even within the safe confines of the Harvard Divinity School. So we have to say that we have not reached the mountaintop. We are not at the place where the children of Dr. King, now grown up, are judged solely by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. We have not reached that point with anyone. If you read Barack Obama's great book, Dreams of My Father, it is striking how he constructs a racial identity over his lifetime. He had only the slightest contact with the parent who gave him his dark skin, and that parent was African, not African American. One might think that culturally and psychologically Barack Obama would grow up white. He is genetically as white as he is black. And much of his upbringing was on Hawaii, and much of it was in Indonesia, both of which cultures have a different take on race than mainland America. But when he got to mainland America to attend college, he brought his dark skin with him, and he was judged on that more than on the content of his character. In a sense, he was assigned a racial identity by society at large. We were not post-racial in the 1980s, and we are not post-racial now, despite electing and re-electing Barack Obama as president. Tomorrow's inauguration is an undeniable milestone for the country, but our reality still lags far behind Dr. King's dream. Now, I have an idea, and it may be right or wrong, but I'll put it out to see who agrees with it. One of the reasons we have not transcended race is that we have evolved a different understanding of it than we had in 1963. When Dr. King said he wanted his children judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin, he was advocating color blindness in the law and in the economy and in the culture. I once asked Cornel West about color blindness, the great race theorist, taught at Harvard while I was there. I took a course from him, and one day he was a guest lecturer in our introductory theology class, where I asked him this question: if there is a heaven, and I get there, and you get there, and I see you, will I see a black man? He replied, yes, you will see a black man, because a black man is who I am. I cannot separate myself from my blackness. I was impressed by this answer, but it made so much sense that I had to ask myself what answer I was expecting. I certainly didn't think he would say that he would somehow become white. I guess I thought that we might all have no skin at all, so there would be no skin color. But the larger point is that we all carry racial identities that are formed to a great extent by the racism of the larger society, to which none of us is immune. My whiteness is as much a part of me as Cornel West's blackness is part of him. So it is that the color blindness which Dr. King lifted up in his dream speech has now become a rallying cry for the right. There is every probability that affirmative action programs, which take an applicant's race into account in trying to achieve racial diversity in schools, colleges, and universities, will be held unconstitutional by the conservative majority on the Supreme Court this term. If they do this, they will likely say that they are required in the admissions process to be colorblind, and conservative opinion will say they're just fulfilling Dr. King's dream. But that thinking ignores history. The burden of 400 years of slavery is not washed out in a generation. The freed slaves were not forcibly deported to Panama, thank goodness, but neither did they get their 40 acres and a mule, and when federal troops withdrew from the South in 1886, they were left at the mercy of the white power structure and Jim Crow. 400 years of slavery were followed by 100 years of oppression, racism, and segregation, and though the most blatant of that has been overcome, there are still yawning gaps of inequality between black and white in education, income, health, and life chances. Color blindness is not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is diversity. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, diversity. The German philosopher George William Friedrich Hegel had a great idea about ideas, how they move through time. There's a thesis, an idea which attracts people to it, and then that idea generates its opposite, the antithesis. And the thesis and antithesis struggle together with each other until they create a synthesis, which resolves the opposition between the two ideas, but on a different plane. The synthesis then acts as the new thesis and generates a new antithesis, which then generates a new synthesis. Hegel called this process the dialectic, and it moves through history in kind of a sawtooth pattern. In my view, that jagged progress is the way things happen in real life. We should not expect a smooth curve. Theodore Parker may have had Hegel's dialectic in mind when he said, the arc of history is not smooth, but it bends toward justice. An observation Martin Luther King Jr. liked to quote. The ideal is always in a dialectical struggle with the real. We have made progress. We are not there yet. The racial legacy of slavery and segregation is still with us. On this 50th year of Dr. King's speech, on the verge of the second term of our first African American president, let us rededicate ourselves to continuing the struggle to overcome that sad and shameful legacy. We shall overcome someday. Though we're not there yet, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall reach that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words